So good morning everybody. I will now present to you a discussion of the scientific arguments in favor and against the theory of evolution. And after the lunch break I will present to you the proofs why there cannot be any evolution. I will start with presenting to you the concept of evolution according to Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. In this book we find the tree of life, which contains all the ideas of evolution. First, this theory says that all the species indicated by the tips of these branches have one common ancestor at the bottom of the tree. And there was a continuous and stepwise change from this single-celled ancestor at the beginning to all the other creatures. That means thousands or millions of intermediate creatures have existed during history of nature. And in this process of evolution, new organs and new functions have been invented. And this happened only by purely natural processes. And the central mechanism were mutation and selection. By copying the genes, when reproduction happens, there appear small copying errors. These are called mutations. And natural selection will find those mutations which are fittest for survival. Now, for a theory to be scientific, we need to have proofs. Science is only that which we can observe and reproduce. If we cannot see evolution in any field of science, then the theory of evolution is not science. And we start with the field of molecular genetics. You probably all have heard the famous statement that ape and man have 99% of their genes in common. However, there are at least three objections against this. One is that similarity does not prove descent. For example, there are many organs in nature which are shared by creatures that are not very closely related according to the theory of evolution. Here you see all these different creatures which have a tongue that can be expanded, and they share it with the pecker. This bird has exactly the same construction. But everybody would understand that this is not a proof that the pecker has evolved from the ant bear or vice versa. So similarity can have other reasons than descent. For example, that there is a need to fulfill the same functions, or that there has been the same engineer who designed this. And furthermore, it has been found that similarity studies on the genetic level lead to very strange relationships of descent. In 2002 it was reported that 99% of the mouse genes are shared with us humans. But certainly nobody would take this as a proof that the mouse came from the man or man came from the mouse. So there must be something wrong with such DNA comparisons, and we can read this in many quotations from the scientific literature that DNA sequence data does not prove evolution. Another objection: when comparing the DNA of the chimpanzee and of man, they did not compare the entire genome, but only 3%. At that time, 97% of the genome was not understood, the function was not known, and from that one concluded it has no function. However, science has progressed and function was found for virtually the entire DNA. And one of the leading pioneers of this research, John Mattick, called what happened in the past the failure to recognize the implications of the non-coding DNA will go down as the biggest mistake in the history of molecular biology. And now, with a more reasonable way of comparing the DNA of ape and chimpanzee, the results are totally different. Meanwhile, we know that when we compare only the so-called Y chromosome in man with the Y chromosome in the chimpanzee, then we find that 60% of our Y chromosome DNA is different from the Y chromosome of chimpanzee, is not contained in the chimpanzee. 60%. That means only in this part of our DNA we have 1 billion letters, nucleotides, which the chimpanzee does not have. And there are more very unexpected results from the studies of the genome of man, like this. Scientists have studied the genome of people in Europe, in America, in Africa, in Asia, everywhere in the world. And they found that all humans have more than 99.9% of their genes in common. This is a big problem for the theory of evolution, because if we have 60% of our Y chromosome different from the ape, there's a huge gap. But among us humans, there is almost complete identity. How can there be a process of evolution? It has stopped in humans, apparently, which is a contradiction to the theory of evolution. On this basis, it is no longer justified to speak of races, of human races, because the little differences which we have, like face of our form of our nose or our hair color, skin color or whatever, is almost nothing compared to what we have together, what we have in common. And there are more surprising discoveries. Scientists found, and all geneticists now agree on that all human beings, wherever they live on Earth, are descended from one single man. This was called by evolutionists the so-called Y chromosome Adam, because they achieved this result by comparing the Y chromosomes everywhere in the world. And that's why they gave it the name Y chromosome Adam, as a sort of irony. But now they regret this choice of name, because it confirms the sacred history of Genesis, of course. And they did also studies with the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to daughter, and studied this in the entire world. And they found that all humans are descended from one single woman. And they gave it the ironic name mitochondrial Eve, which they now regret, because it confirms that Adam and Eve were literal historical persons. In order to convince yourself, just type in Y chromosome Adam or mitochondrial Eve in Google and you will find many articles on this. So there is no proof for evolution in molecular biology. Let us move to another research field, to embryology. Ernst Haeckel proposed the so-called biogenetic law, according to which, you may have heard this, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's the famous formula. And Julian Huxley described this law in his book, The Wonderful World of Life, 100 years after Darwin's publication, Origin of Species. And he says that embryology gives us the most striking proof of evolution. Many animals, which are extremely different as adults, are hard to tell apart as embryos. You yourself, when you were a young embryo, were very like the embryos of lizards, rabbits, chickens, dogfish, and other vertebrates. The only reasonable explanation is that we vertebrates are all related by common descent. Now, first we must say that Huxley makes the same mistake as was done with the DNA comparisons. This error is, he concludes from similarity to descent, which is a wrong logic. But let us examine further whether there is really this similarity. The evidence for the biogenetic law was this. This is still found in some textbooks of the 21st century. It shows the embryos of different kind of creatures, of fish, salamander, turtle, chicken and so on, and human on the right side, at the same stage of development. And according to Haeckel's drawings, they were almost identical at the beginning. And only later they become more and more different. In other words, the message of this drawing is, in the beginning, man was like a fish. These drawings have already been criticized when Haeckel was alive. But it took 120 years until a British anatomist used modern microscopes to examine the embryos of these different creatures at the same early stage of development. And this is what he found. So this is Haeckel's data in the top row, Haeckel's drawing in the top row, and these are real photographs below. So as you see, there are huge differences between human, rabbit, chicken, turtle, and salamander, and fish. So you have to look here at these structures. This is a yolk sac, does not belong to the embryo. And you see that Haeckel's drawings were wrong. Michael Richardson published his results in the scientific literature and gave an interview in Times London in 1997. He said, "This is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud. It's shocking to find that somebody one thought was a great scientist was deliberately misleading. What Haeckel did was to take a human embryo and copy it, pretending that the salamander and the pig and all the others look the same at the same stage of development. They don't. These are fakes. And still today you find people who claim that human embryos have gill slits at an early stage of development. However, when we read the textbooks, we find that these so-called gill arches have nothing to do with breathing at all. They only look like gills if you look at them from far away. Their real name is pharyngeal arches. And these pharyngeal arches, they are the earliest stages of the development of the neck and of the face. It's just the first step of this development. It has nothing to do with gills. And sometimes people claim that human embryos have a tail. However, the real name is caudal eminence. And it only looks like a tail if you look from far away, but it never has the function or the contents of a tail. And we know that from the scientific literature that this structure is not something which is there at a certain stage of development and later reduced, but that from this it's just the first structure, and from this all the material of the spinal cord is taken. This is changed into the spinal cord, or it's the basis for the spinal cord. And to convince yourself, this is an NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance image of the embryonic development of a human embryo. And you see here that the caudal eminence, which some people call tail, exists already very early, before all the other organs exist. And later, all the other organs are coming without reducing the caudal eminence, which clearly proves that this had nothing to do with the tail. However, a science article in 1969 already criticized and refuted the biogenetic law and told the world that it is difficult to get it out of the minds of people. So we have no proof in the field of embryology for the theory of evolution. Let's move on to the research field of anatomy. Wiedersheim, a German evolutionist, suggested that there are 100 so-called vestigial organs in man. These are organs which, according to him, have no function or only a reduced function, because they are leftovers from the process of evolution. One famous example is the vermiform appendix. However, in the same way as with the junk DNA, science has progressed and functions were found. We know now that the vermiform appendix is important for the immune system, especially in the first 10 years of our life. Later, other organs can take over this function, so it's not very harmful to remove the vermiform appendix. Another famous example are the tonsils. tonsillectomy was once the most frequently performed piece of surgery. Doctors once thought that tonsils were simply useless evolutionary leftovers, and they took them out thinking that it could do no harm. But in the same way, science has progressed and functions were found. And today, doctors are more reluctant to remove the tonsils because we have found that the tonsils are important for the immune system. And in the journal Evolutionary Theory, we could read in 1981 the following text. Wiedersheim was largely in error in compiling his long list of vestigial organs. Most of them do have at least a minor function at some point in life. The list of 100 useless organs has today shrinked to 4 or 5. And it's probably only a matter of time until we also discover the function of these 5. And you see that Wiedersheim made the same logical mistake as the biologists with the junk DNA. From not understanding the functions, they concluded there are no functions. This is as if when I open the boot of a car or the engine space of a car and I see many valves and tubes and I don't understand what they are doing, would I conclude they are doing nothing? I can remove them. But if I started from thinking my car is a product of evolution, then it's very likely there is a lot of garbage, and probably I can remove a lot of it and make it run faster in that way. And this is exactly the reasoning that made it possible that so many brilliant scientists believed that junk DNA exists and vestigial organs do exist. So there is no proof for the theory of evolution in anatomy. Let us continue with paleontology. Everywhere in nature we find these beautiful sedimentary strata. And according to the theory of Charles Lyell, the deeper strata are very much older than the younger ones, than the one on top. And in these strata we find millions of beautifully preserved fossils. And apparently there is a succession of the appearance of different groups of fossils, of creatures, in the geologic column. This gives us a very good opportunity to apply the real scientific method, which is I formulate a hypothesis and make a prediction and test in the observation of nature whether this is true, whether I really observe what my prediction according to the hypothesis suggests. If Darwin's tree of life were true, we should find that the fossils which we find at the highest layers are becoming more and more similar the deeper we are finding them. But this is what we find in the fossil record. Here is a comparison only of a few mammals. The same you will find for insects, for birds, for plants, for all families and creatures on Earth, that there is no convergence when you go deeper and deeper in the fossil record. For example, the rabbit fossils which you get in the top layer, they are the same when you dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and the rodents also, and the primates, the bats, the insectivores, they do not become more and more similar as the tree of life of Charles Darwin predicts. The only thing which changes is the broad, which indicates the number of different races of this kind of family, but the basic construction stays the same. Here are some examples of fossils, and you will see no difference to the same creature living today. This is a fossilized scorpion which contains all the structures of today's scorpions. No sign of evolution. This crab is perfectly formed in its fossilized form, like today. Where are the fossils of the half-evolved crab? If you can present them, you will win the Nobel Prize. The same in the plant kingdom. You see this leaf, marble leaf here, and the actual leaf. Many such images I could show to you, the most beautiful and very complicated structures, always the same no evolution. Therefore, evolutionist Niles Eldredge admitted in 1998, it is a simple, ineluctable truth that virtually all members of a biota remain basically stable, with minor fluctuations throughout their durations. And Mark Ridley, who works together with Richard Dawkins, wrote in New Scientist, in any case, no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. Let us now focus on a very important subsection of paleontology, paleoanthropology, the search for the ape man. And one of the most famous candidates for an ape man has been Neanderthal man. This drawing has been published more than 100 years ago according to the reconstruction of a skeleton found by Marceline Boole. And Marceline Boole believed that the Neanderthal were real ape men shown like in this image. For example, that he had a toe which was positioned in this way like a climbing monkey. However, it took 50 years until the scientific method was applied, which is reproduce your result, check again. So after 50 years, another group of researchers re-examined this reconstruction of Marceline Boole. And after 50 years of teaching the world that Neanderthal man is the searched ape man, Scientific American wrote in 1979, to summarize, Boole and others were mistaken. Neanderthals were not less human than modern man. And Wolpoff points out that Neanderthals have some differences compared to most people today, but there are human people groups like Aborigines in Australia which have some typical characters of the Neanderthals, like the large brow ridges. But he points out that such small differences do not make Aborigines more primitive than Europeans, but instead it shows that Neanderthal is modern. And Gerd Christian Weninger, the director of the Neanderthal Museum in Mettmann in Germany, wrote last year that we have to overcome the myth of the wild man. And he continues to say that nobody could ever prove that these differences of the Neanderthal have anything to do with evolution. It could just be chance, like the differences among us, among the different people groups, are just random. And this is how a modern reconstruction looks in the Neanderthal Museum in Germany. If you put him in a suite like this, you would not consider this person as non-human. Another example, Homo erectus. This is a timber of the Republic of Uzbekistan, which has been printed in 2002, showing Homo erectus as the ape man. However, the authors of this timber have not studied the scientific literature. If they had done, then they would have read many articles which prove that the Homo erectus is as Homo as Neanderthals and as everybody of us here. For example, in this last sentence here, the range of variation of most features of Homo erectus falls within that of modern man. And leading paleoanthropologist Wolpoff admits that there is no boundary between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. We cannot distinguish them. They are belonging to the same human family. Another very influential ape man candidate was the Pilton man. This skull has been taught in American school textbooks for 40 years. The finder of this skull was honored to the knighthood by the English king for this great contribution to humankind, to human culture. This is a famous image of this so-called Man of Sussex in England. This is an article of the New York Times in 1912, which says that Darwin's theory is now proved true. And the proof is the skull of the Pilton man. Again, it took 40 years until the scientific method has been applied and one has checked whether one can reproduce this result. And this was the result. In the Time magazine in 1953, an article was published which summarized that the skull of the Piltdown man was a human skull, but the lower jaw was from an orangutan and the teeth came from a chimpanzee. They were all put together artificially, and to make it look older, the bones had been stained with iron solution and with chromic acid, and the teeth were filed. Generations of American students have been educated in this. Now you do no longer find it in the textbook. Another famous ape-man candidate was Nebraska man. This is an article in the London Illustrated News in 1920. And it seems that scientists have now found how man behaved, how he looked in our long history. But what had they actually found? This. One tooth. From this tooth they have concluded these images which I just showed you. However, after 7 years they had to admit that this tooth did not come from a human or from an ape-man, but from an animal. So today nobody speaks anymore of Nebraska man. Ramapithecus, another ape-man candidate, they found a broken jaw and reconstructed it in a V shape, which is typical for human. But they found more, and they had to admit, they found intact ones, and they had to admit that the real reconstruction is parallel, which is non-human-like. Therefore, it is now considered by many that Ramapithecus is just an ancestor of the orangutan and not an ape-man. This leaves us with the last candidates, Australopithecines. And there's a broad variety of Australopithecines. You have heard about Lucy, for example. And they are all very different among each other, but they have many characteristics together. And some scientists took some characteristics, for example, certain teeth, and said, look, these parts are very similar to human teeth. But they made the same mistake as I showed before. When you take the pecker, the tongue of the pecker, and compare it to the tongue of the ant bear, you would conclude pecker and ant bear are very closely related. But that's of course false. You have to consider the entire organism, not just some isolated details. And here is a table of all the shared characteristics of the different kinds of Australopithecines. And there is one property which is like in man. This is the position of the hip joints. However, there are several properties which are clearly ape-like, and other properties which are neither man-like nor ape-like, but which are belonging to a different category of animal. For example, they had a very special way of bipedal walk ability, but this was totally different from human bipedal walk. And they had a special climbing hand with banded bones, which indicate that these creatures were moving in the wood, in the forest, and not on two legs all the time. So overall, Australopithecines are just extinct apes. And there is much in the scientific literature which confirms this. I have not the time to read everything to you. I conclude this chapter with Homo habilis, the so-called Homo habilis. And here one has found many characteristics which make it clear that Homo habilis belongs to the Australopithecines and not to Homo. So this leaves us with the end that no species has been found with almost human overall features. That would be an ape-man. What we have found in the fossil record were great apes like gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans or Australopithecines, And we have found that there are humans. There are Homo sapiens, as we call us here today, but also Neanderthals and Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, which are 100% human. But we have not found anything in between. Now, before we come to the break, let me quickly comment on the theory of Charles Lyell, how these sedimentary strata formed, because it's very important. And we have already talked about this impact on the interpretation of Genesis. If there is water that covers the earth and the water stands still, the sediments settle slowly and form after the water has withdrawn these layers. However, Charles Lyell did not think of water moving. And this is the case whenever there is some flood. Water moves very rapidly, and scientists have constructed huge experiments to simulate this situation. If you go to this website, you can find a description of experiments where water, which contained different particles, sand particles, was moving rapidly in such channels. And they found this unexpected mechanism of sedimentary strata formation, which does not agree with the theory of Charles Lyell. If water moves horizontally, here from left to right, then the particles are sorted according to their shape, their size, or their density. So you see, you obtain very rapidly parallel strata, and they are not deposited over millions of years vertically. And these are the results after the water has been removed in these channels. And there are many observations in nature which confirm that it was indeed this mechanism which produced the sedimentary strata, the rock formations all over the world. For example, we find many tree trunk fossils ranging through several layers. This cannot have been produced in millions of years. And very easy to see, there is no erosion or irregularity at the interfaces from one strata to the next strata. They are perfectly parallel. But how can this be? Because on the top you see a lot of erosion and irregularity. So if now the water came again and covered the earth and the new layer of sediment settled down, you would certainly not get a parallel strata here on top added. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that these structures have been exposed to sun, wind and weather for millions of years before the next strata formed. And one recent result, which was very unexpected, was a finding in dinosaur bones. Dinosaur bones are usually found in strata which are supposed to be 65 million years old. And if you go to the internet and search for the name Mary Schweitzer, you find many publications in important scientific journals over 20 years which confirm that these things can be found in dinosaur bones. Like this soft tissue, you can pull it apart and it will go again back into its original position like rubber. Or this blood vessel, totally intact. This nucleus of a blood cell. The nucleus is black, which is typical for reptiles. The complicated DNA molecule has a half-life of 500 years only. So after 5,000 years, you should not be able to see any reasonable code anymore. How can all these things be 65 million years old? Those who have found this speak of an unknown preservation mechanism. So that's why it's very unlikely that Lyell's mechanism of strata formation is true. And the apparent succession of the different creatures in the fossil record may, for example, be explained by the place where these creatures were living. So, I think this would be a good time for a lunch break. And we can continue after lunch with either with search for proofs in population genetics or immediately with the proofs against evolution why it cannot happen. So thanks for your attention.